behalf of YWCA Glendale and Pasadena and the panelists of today's event, I want to welcome you to Equity and Justice, Homelessness and Housing. So thank you so much for joining us. I am Fabiola Montiel Tellez. I am the Director of Racial and Gender Equity at YWCA Glendale and Pasadena. And my gender pronouns are she, they, and ella, ella. We begin today's event with a land acknowledgement. I invite you to join me in reading through this land acknowledgement. We acknowledge Tongva, Kish, and Chumash peoples as the traditional land caretakers of the Los Angeles Basin and the Southern Channel Islands. Honor their elders, past and present. We acknowledge people's resistance against displacement and erasure. We honor our ancestors and welcome present relatives' relations. We commit to caring for these lands for the next generations. We kindly invite you to think of a past, present, or future relative or relation you want to honor and invite to our shared space today. If you want to know more about Indigenous lands, you can go to nativeland.ca. We share this land acknowledgement as an invitation to you and our recommitment to racial justice. Thank you so much for participating in that land acknowledgement. Now let's move on to some quick reminders about community agreements for our discussion today. The first three community agreements are individual, and they are active participation. You can use Zoom reactions like thumbs up or applause, etc., and use the chat to comment and ask questions. Sharing your experience using I statements. And also, we offer you an invitation to add pronouns and affiliation if you want to rename yourselves in the participants list. The last four community agreements describe collective action. They are to cultivate a sense of belonging by tending bridges to others and listening with an open mind and seeking connections with others. We can all acknowledge that conversations and dialogue about race and gender equity and social change are ongoing. Therefore, we expect and accept non-closure. Our event today is the result of collaboration with the presenting panelists. And on behalf of YWCA Glendale and Pasadena, we want to thank you for being here. As a reminder, throughout the event, you can post questions in the chat, which will be monitored by Dr. Crystal Ishihara from Saybrook University, our partner for today's event. Thank you, Crystal and Saybrook, for partnering with us in racial justice efforts. And now I will introduce our moderator, Tara Peterson, CEO of YWCA Glendale and Pasadena, an organization which provides resources and support to survivors of domestic violence and their children through education and prevention efforts that empower women, girls, and families to build healthy relationships, achieve self-sufficiency, and live free from violence. YWCA Glendale and Pasadena is the only organization in Glendale and surrounding cities offering emergency shelter to survivors of domestic violence, managing a 16-bed domestic violence emergency shelter. The programs that they offer include a 24/7 domestic violence crisis hotline, a domestic violence community services center, year-round girls empowerment programs focused on STEAM education and violence prevention, and a racial justice program on education and policy advocacy. Tara, now is your turn. I will spotlight you now.
Thank Thank you so much, Fabiola, and thank you everyone for being here. It's great to see so many familiar names and organizations in the chat, and to also see some new friends and new names in the chat, so welcome. We have an incredible panel of advocates and organizations working to advance racial justice in housing and prevent homelessness who are joining us here today, and I know that many of you are also on the front lines doing this work. Let's start by affirming that safe, quality, and affordable housing must be available for all, especially low-income families. Generally safe, quality, affordable housing promotes health, mental health, civic participation, and community building. It's crucial to children's and pregnant people's well-being. These are why access to a place called home shouldn't be a scene in the American dream or opportunity. The current homeless and housing crisis have different economic reasons. Still, its origins are in the historical, exclusionary, and racist housing, employment, and voting policies that prevented Black, Latinx, Native Americans, and Indigenous people from building wealth and having a fair chance at opportunity. We aim tonight to increase our understanding of the barriers and solutions for unsheltered, unhoused people face when seeking services. We hope to promote a sense of community, a sense of belonging, and a continued fight for housing justice. And those wanting to take action, we know of and those who want to take action, we want you to know of the resources that are available to advocate for housing justice, and would also invite you all to register for YWCA Glendale's and Pasadena's Racial Justice Challenge. YWCA Glendale and Pasadena presents tonight's panel as part of our Until Justice Just Is campaign. We are elevating our social justice partners' actions until we achieve that fair and inclusive tomorrow we deserve, until we are treated with dignity, with respect, and equality, until justice, including housing justice, is an expectation, not the exception. We will hear from 4 civic and nonprofit leaders in homeless response, domestic violence intervention, and housing justice, followed by a Q&A. Our first panelist is Brandon Lamar. Brandon is the chair of the Pasadena Human Relations Commission. Its purpose is to aid the city in achieving better human relations in city government and assist private persons and groups in promoting goodwill, better relations among all people. Brandon serves on the executive boards of the Pasadena NAACP, Pasadena Organizing for Progress, Leadership Pasadena, and Black Los Angeles Young Democrats. Welcome, Brandon.
Hey, thank you so much, Tara. It's really exciting to be here. I'm glad I got the invite, and I'm glad to be able to share the small knowledge and wisdom that I have with you all tonight. Housing and equality and equity housing is something that's so important to all of us in LA County. It is very important here, especially in Pasadena, where the median house now is $1 million. And so talking about housing, we also have to talk about living wages as well. Because cost of living is going up, we have to start paying people what they deserve, right? And so, just here in Pasadena, I'm sure all of you are aware, if you're in LA County, this Pasadena residents had just passed Measure H for rent control, to bring rent control into Pasadena, which is an amazing success, as you would call it. We haven't really started the strides to do it now. We're a week away from the rental board actually being implemented. And so we're excited for this process and this progress. And we are elated that a lot of our people that are here in Pasadena are going to be able to stay here because of rent control. So I'm excited to be here with you once again, and excited to just share whatever knowledge that I have with you all tonight. Good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. Our second panelist is Betti Robinson, Director of Training and Partnership with Downtown Women's Center, the only organization in Los Angeles focused exclusively on serving and empowering women experiencing homelessness and formerly homeless women. Betti develops and manages intervention programs for survivors of gender-based violence and those with complex trauma. Betti is a co-chair of the Downtown Women's Center Trauma and Resiliency Informed Care Task Force and a member of the core team for the Domestic Violence Homeless Service Coalition. Welcome, Betti.
Thank you so much, Tara. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for welcoming me into the space. It's an honor to be here amongst the other panelists and to join you as well in the amazing work that I know you all do every day. And just to speak a little bit more, I am excited to talk about some of the innovative work that we're doing in LA County and across California. One special message, I think, specifically that really aligns in my representation as a staff member of DWC, Downtown Women's Center, and as a core member of the Domestic Violence Homeless Services Coalition, is that our goal and our vision is that we don't have to live in a world where an individual or family has to choose between stable and safe housing or to live a life free of violence. So the policy work that we center ourselves around, the trainings, the collaborations, the partnership building is really to one day achieve this vision. And we just are excited to have this conversation with you, and I look forward to hearing your questions and talking a little bit more about that work. Thank you again.
Thank you, Betti, and thank you so much for the partnership and the work that you do. I would now like to introduce Rabeya. I'm just really happy to have you on this panel and to have known you for several decades in doing this work. Rabeya, for you all, is the Director of Policy at Esperanza Community Housing Corporation, a South Central Los Angeles social justice nonprofit that achieves long-term comprehensive community development. Rabeya works on issues related to affordable housing, equitable development and anti-displacement strategies, environmental justice, health access, racial justice, immigrant rights, and so much more. Welcome, Rabeya.
Thanks, Tara. Thanks for having me. I did prepare some remarks, so please bear with me. I just wanted to begin by saying thank you for having me here. At Esperanza, we believe that housing is both a health and human right, and therefore our policy advocacy addresses racial justice by linking housing justice, environmental justice, immigrant rights, and equitable development. Now, we all want healthy, livable neighborhoods with access to safe, affordable housing. We want to address climate change and so much more. And yet, when we talk about healthy neighborhoods, we have to ask ourselves, how is that possible in the current landscape where extractive policies have created and perpetuate social and economic inequities, and housing and human health have been inextricably linked and must be addressed simultaneously? The fact is that LA's segregated landscape is a direct result of both planning and zoning policies and financing policies that, because of this country's roots in slavery and genocide, are imbued with systemic racism. These policies have dictated not only where housing can be built and whom it can be built for and made available to, but also where polluting industries themselves are allowed to operate and thereby begin to poison our homes and our neighborhoods. And we see the financing systems as well working together, designed specifically to deny resources to certain communities, especially Black communities, while helping others, especially the white communities. We saw this, for example, with the New Deal in the 1930s and 40s, when the federal government further enshrined segregation and racism in housing by codifying redlining policies for both our financial and planning systems, and thereby also bolstering California's racist restrictive covenants. Simultaneously, we also saw local planning policies dictate neighborhood health itself. In the city of LA, for example, somewhere through the 1950s and 60s, the city began allowing more and more toxic industries, especially big oil, to operate in neighborhoods such as South LA and other communities of color and contaminate the land and poison the homes and neighborhoods there. And just for a quick second, I want to go back to the financing systems, because it wasn't just redlining. It was also issues such as Reagan in the 1980s with his trickle-down economics, where he weakened the Fair Housing Act, which, as you may know, was enacted in the 1960s to redress harms of redlining. But Reagan comes in and weakens it by declaring that public housing was a failed strategy. And instead, he replaced it with a financing system ostensibly for more affordable housing development, but actually just based on tax credits and tax incentives, and that also just benefit private investors such as big banks and other private equity firms. So however you see it, we have a set of policies that have created a crisis of housing affordability, of homelessness, of environmental racism, and worsening health outcomes, all by insisting we sacrifice certain communities for the benefit of others. So these are our planning and financing policies at work: entrenching systemic racism, creating a place of haves and have-nots, and creating the twin crises of housing and homelessness, all because we want to commodify everything from shelter to food to health to everything else. And this is how eventually our false narrative takes root, because unfortunately, people are trying to address this, but they're trying to do it by ignoring the racism that is endemic to our planning and financing systems. We see folks relying on half measures, therefore, in response to these twin crises. They are mistakenly identifying them as simply a crisis of supply and demand, simply a lack of housing, not one of access to safe, affordable housing, and certainly not one of systemic racism. And therefore, this problem is giving us false choices of having to choose either our homes or our health, either our jobs or our health, and so much more. And what we're seeing in our work at Esperanza, for example, is a slew of housing production bills that falsely scapegoats a key environmental and public health protection in California law. And it scapegoats that law by saying that it is, in fact, the main barrier to building affordable housing. This false solution, again, it's predicated on a cynical assumption that we have to sacrifice some to benefit others. And as history shows, we know who lives in the sacrifice zones and who benefits. And we cannot and we will not continue to accept this narrative and allow our systems to escape accountability. This is why we say that housing is a fundamental health and human right, and that housing justice and environmental justice are inextricably linked. And this is why we work with our allies on policies that center those most impacted, that are about funding housing at the deepest affordability levels, that establish resources and policies to ensure proper remediation of toxic sites so we don't leave behind a legacy of contamination, and instead ensure frontline communities have access to land for healthy community-serving land use. So that we work for tenant protections, and most importantly, so that we are exploring alternative models of housing that decommodify housing and remove it from the speculative market. Thanks.
Thank you, Rabeya. I am like just taking so many notes here because you just dropped so many gems, and thank you so much for that, and that perspective and that lens, and bringing that to all of that to the table. And I really hope as we continue on this conversation, we can start to unpack some of that and talk about some of the solutions to address some of those those deep systemic issues that you just talked about. And wow, so much to unpack there, but I'm going to go to our next panelist. So thank you again, Rabeya. Our final panelist is Reverend Zachary Hoover. He's the Executive Director of LA Voice, a multiracial, multi-faith community organization that awakens people to their own power, training them to speak, act, and work together to transform our county into one that reflects the dignity of all people. Reverend Zach holds a Master's of Divinity from Harvard Divinity School and is ordained in the American Baptist Church. Thank you, Zach.
Thanks, Tara. Thank you, Fabiola. It's great to be here. Hard to follow Rabeya, who just took us to school. I saw that there's someone here from Indiana. So as a native Hoosier, I have to say hi to Gretchen, even though I don't know you. So, yeah. And I think what I've been asked to share a little bit about, in some of my perspective that I bring today, is the work of coalitions. So I wanted to start by just grounding us in, really the basic nature of them. And just reminding us that the work of democracy is the work of coalitions. Like doing the people's work requires coalitions. When de Tocqueville visited our country early on from France to see like what was working, of course, at that time, there were many things that were not good. But one of the things he noticed that was working for democracy was free associations of people who could organize around their interests. That still is true. The conditions are very different. oppression has evolved, power has evolved, but the need for people to come together around interests is still true, even for government. I mean, Dominic is on, he could tell us about the work of coalitions within those who are helping to govern. The big things that happen across the county, whether it's on housing or something else, require large coalitions of people who are coming together around shared interests. I think almost every big win that we've had around these issues in recent years, I'm going to just focus on housing, whether we're talking about Measure H in Pasadena, or County Measure H, or Triple H, or the recent win around La Casa, the LA County Affordable Housing Solutions Agency. Early in the pandemic, Rabeya and I and many other organizations worked together to create Healthy LA and to try to protect people in LA City and LA County from all kinds of different things that were going on for our folks. You know, you could just kind of go down the list of anything big that has been won, and it is always a coalition. I'm here tonight at a meeting that is going to be a coalition conversation with people governing in the city of LA about what do we do to work together to try to help people who are going to be facing eviction, or already facing eviction, or going to be facing eviction. So I think, you know, if we ask ourselves, how do we really make progress on these big challenges that Rabeya just laid out for us? It's going to require a bunch of us. And just a couple quick thoughts about what are the things that are active inside coalition, and then I'll be done. One, I've said a bunch: aligned and shared interests. And at LA Voice, like, not only is our own organization a whole bunch of congregations that have decided they have an aligned and shared interest, both short-term and long-term, but that's what coalitions are too. It's us in this room together saying, where do we have shared interest, both in the short term, now till next June or something, as well as like the next 10 years, the next 30 years, the next 50 years. The second thing is relationship. If we're not actually relating to each other in some way, it's very difficult to trust each other and do the work together. We've all got stuff going on in our organizations, in our lives, in our volunteer work, and our leadership work. So we have to lean into relationships so that we can speed up trust. And the third thing I've seen in successful coalitions is just real clarity about what it's about and what it's not about. You know, like, there's a million things that we maybe want to work on. Maybe there's only 20, I don't know, but we have to decide, like, what are the things we're really going to focus on? And what are the things we're going to say, yeah, that matters to us, but this coalition's not for that. Another coalition is handling that, or other people are taking care of that work. So it's kind of that St. Francis question of what is ours to do? What is ours to do? And then I think the last thing is just clarity about power. Coalitions are for power. The purpose of coming together around aligned interests, building relationships, and being clear about goals is because it makes us more powerful. And these forces that we are up against are in coalition. Things are the way they are because of coalitions. They may not have been our coalitions. And so the question is, what is the coalition, or what are the coalitions that need to emerge? Small ones, big ones, unlikely allies, for us to be able to make progress on these big challenges that we're all sharing about tonight. So it's great to be here. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much. Sorry about that. We're going to start a conversation. And just to be clear, really clear, is that we're here talking about, I've heard a lot about root causes of homelessness, and making it really clear that those root causes are not personal deficits. We're discussing historically unjust laws and policies, and this is how it's always been done type of practices. We're hearing about on-the-ground solutions and advocacy to identify and define housing as a human rights issue. So to the panel, what does California look like under this recognition? What would California look like if we truly centered housing as a human right issue? Who wants to take that? I'm going to volunteer.
Yes, I'll go.
Okay, go ahead. You go first, Brandon. Thank you.
No, we try to be nice on these things. Someone else go first. But I think what it looks like for California is what Mayor Bass has stated. It would be the entire state would actually consider it as a state of emergency, meaning all hands on deck to make sure that our individuals and families are actually housed, right? Making sure that people not only are housed, but they also are in safe conditions when they're housed, right? Because you have people that are housed, but they have mildew, they have house haven't been fixed, or apartments haven't been fixed in years. And so making sure that they're actually safely housed, and making sure that that they're not only just housed, but they're also, as I stated before, having making livable wages, right? That we have equitable jobs so that people can actually afford where they live. So I think for me, that's what I would consider as California taking on this, is making sure that the entire state takes it on as a state of emergency, meaning that all hands are on deck to make sure that our individuals, our families, our young people are safely housed. When I worked in homeless services, it broke my heart that I actually saw young people that were living on the streets without families. And so that's a big need for me. And it goes all the way into not just homeless services, but it also goes into foster care, right? LA County has the biggest foster care system in the entire United States. We have more foster care youth in our LA County than we do in the entire state of Texas. And that should tell us something, right? But also foster care youth has the highest rate of being homeless when they age out. And so, there's an issue right there. And so, for me, it's just like I said, making sure that it's a state of emergency, that everybody, it's all hands on deck, making sure that our families and our young people are housed and housed safely. So that's what it really looks like to me.
Thank you. Rabeya, you talked a lot. You shared about the planning, zoning, and the financing, and you shared, really about the historical context and the current landscape that we're in, and what has led to this current all of the things that led to this current landscape, right? So what would California look like for you if we were able to shift that landscape? What would a new landscape look like for you?
Well, I think, in a nutshell, we would be living a reality of abundance, and really rejecting the scraps that are constantly thrown our way, right? That leave us fighting with each other. I mean, for example, we are both a housing justice and environmental justice organization. And yet we often find ourselves in the midst of policy discussions where lawmakers are saying, we can help you build more affordable housing if you'll just agree to bypass these environmental justice and these public health protections. And I feel like those are scraps being thrown at us because people are not willing to do the real work, which is actually changing our systems. And they're throwing us these scraps to distract us from these other pieces, which then goes to our financing systems, where we're seeing private equity firms and some really bad faith players, such as, say, Blackstone, which I don't know how many of you all are aware of Blackstone, right? But I think, was it WHO who in 2016 declared Blackstone one of the global drivers of global homelessness and the housing crisis, right? It's distracting from those pieces where those private equity firms and corporate landlords are really coming in and using our homes and our communities as their gamble, as their way to make their investments and make their profits, and thereby playing with people's lives. And we're seeing this especially, in communities, as we put it, that are most at risk for gentrification and displacement. And quite frankly, those are low-income communities of color. And it was not just Ronald Reagan, but as recently as 2017, with Trump and the GOP tax reform bill, where they created the opportunity zones, which, as far as I can see, are just another way to create tax shelters for rich people and private equity firms to, quote unquote, invest in these communities, but really they're investing to turn a profit. So then, what is that incentive for them to truly ensure that we're building healthy, affordable housing at the deepest affordability levels, that we're truly addressing what's happening here with this history of systemic racism with our zoning and planning policies. And so if we were to realize housing as a health and human right, I would see us as really turning things on its head, no longer centering corporate and business profits, but rather centering our homes and human health and really valuing what that means when it comes to helping people and families and communities thrive as a collective.
Thank you, Rabeya. And Zach, and Reverend Zach, you talked a little bit about, I would love to hear your response to this question. And one of the things that stood out for me is around the coalition work and coalition building and the need for something new to emerge. What would that look like in a community or a state that centers housing and and homelessness as a human rights issue?
That's a great question. I'm hearing two parts to it. And I think the thing that's coming to mind first is the name of our current statewide campaign, which is Home is Sacred.
Mm.
So things that we hold dear, we nurture and protect them. And we do what it takes to nurture and protect them. And we prioritize what we do around nurturing and protecting things that we hold dear, that we hold sacred. So I think I just envision, I mean, God, wouldn't it be great? Like, okay, so my son's 7, you know, when he's I don't know, let's just say when he's 37, for him to say, wow, you mean it used to be like that in California instead of like it is now? And I'd say, yeah, you don't remember what it would be like when we would drive through the neighborhood and you would ask me about the people that were living in the tent at the bottom of our street, or why they were there, or we'd hear about our friends from our church who, you know, so I think like, what would he say it's like instead? And I think he'd say, I just can't believe it was like that. I mean, everybody has a home. Everybody's safe. Wow, why did we let that happen for so long? And so then I think if it's like from really this vision place, then what will that require of us? And I think like the coalition has to contain both incredibly sharp analysis and like really clear people who can really clearly articulate like the power map, interests that are working together. And I think something that it has to include vision and imagination. And I also think like, obviously this is, I mean, I sort of take this for granted. I almost forget to say it because it's just part of our organization, but those who are most directly impacted are going to be at the center of crafting the solutions. And also those emerging leaders who have a taste of that future that's possible, who are going to be both directly impacted people and also less directly impacted people. And I think it's just going to take such a shared effort. I mean, Mayor Richardson has said a similar thing, like all hands on deck. Everybody's got a part to play. I think the last thing I'll say, Tara, on this is like, I've noticed like a lot of people working on the same thing who don't know of each other or don't know each other. Absolutely. It's kind of impossible in a huge place. You can't know everybody or know of everybody, but it seems that there are opportunities we may be missing between practitioners and organizers and electeds there's so many different configurations that could bring richness to what we're doing. And it doesn't all have to be one big coalition, you know, it'd be a coalition of coalitions, which is kind of what we have right now. I hope that helps.
Absolutely. Thank you, Reverend Zach. And Betti, I want to also get to you on this question as someone who's really working at the intersection and violence against women and homelessness, and knowing the importance of centering those people who are directly impacted, as Reverend Zach just mentioned. What would it look like for you in the lens of the work that you do?
Yeah, thank you. And so as we asked this question, what came to mind is the HELP Act. It's an act that we sponsored in conjunction with Senator Rubio, and it really is intended to provide support to LA City's domestic violence survivors, unaccompanied women, and transgendered individuals. And the goal of the HELP Act is to require cities, counties, and continuums of care that receive state funding to address homelessness and provide services and resources to these vulnerable populations. And I think that is a big gap that currently exists, is whenever there is state or federal funding, stipulation specifically on how to support gender-based violence survivors is not clearly stated, which then leaves us in a situation where we are trying to scramble for how do we allocate this funding to the needs of survivors versus meeting that need before it becomes an issue. And this is something that we see regularly, is that access to resources for survivors is limited, whether it's the number of emergency shelter that's available, the availability of transitional shelter. There are just limitations to the reality of the scope of how many survivors we have within LA County for the scope of resources that are available. And to your point, we know that it is inextricably linked. We know that there is a correlation between those that are facing violence and the fear of whether to leave a dangerous situation, but the lack of access to housing, let alone if there's financial abuse, a limitation to financially being able to sustain housing, let alone in LA County. So I really think that we could do a lot better when we look at our housing funding and really ensuring that these vulnerable populations are represented and that resources are being funneled in a way that's low barrier and really meets the needs of individuals. And then I think that's something that's really lacking currently, especially when we talk about low barrier. Survivors who are leaving abusive situations or trying to access housing already are facing barriers through the systems that we have in place, whether it's making a report, going to court, trying to get access to a restraining order, trying to manage the day-to-day responsibilities that they may now have as a single parent while simultaneously trying to work on their wellness and healing, let alone when now you don't have access to housing or the ability to get access to resources that you know are otherwise available but are so limited in nature that not all survivors can access them. And I think as we talk about this act, I think it's hopefully going to really help California become more of a national leader in ensuring that there is gender equity and homelessness response. That way, these vulnerable populations are uplifted in these funding allocations that come through the state.
Thank you, Betti. You know, I was listening, as I listened to you all's talk, I was hearing just lots of different policy changes and initiatives that you all have been a part of and talked about, from the Health Act to Measure H and all of these different measures and advocacy. I was just curious if there's any other advocacy or legislative or at the local level or policy level, or if you want to share kind of the role that you played as an organization or individual in really advancing change through policy, and how you were able to do that and navigate that, and if you were able to see any success as a result of that policy change. Anyone have anything to share around their policy advocacy work? I know a lot of you guys have been working on this for a long time. Brandon, you want to share a little bit about the work you did in Pasadena with rent control? You know, in Glendale, we don't have rent control. So maybe we can, those of us who are in Glendale who are renting, maybe we can learn from you. So maybe you can give us talk a little bit about what you all came together to do and to achieve, and what you're hoping to see as a result of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to give you some backgrounds, 70% of renters in Pasadena are actually paying between 50 to 80% of their income in rent, which means they are not able to save pretty much, because if you're paying 50 to 80% of your income in rent, that's not including your car note, that's not including insurance, that's not including food, your light bill, and all the other stuff that you have to pay, right? And so there's a dire need there. We have seen a dire need for rent control. And so rent control actually came in 2016, and we didn't get enough signatures in 2016. And then it came right back in 2020, 2021. And the community really saw the need for rent control. And so we were able to get over 25,000 signatures to get it on the ballot. And then it got on the ballot and it passed. And so we were happy to do that. But I think it goes all the way back to Reverend Zach's comment of coalition building. If it wasn't for coalitions like Pasadena's Organizing for Progress, like our Pasadena Tenants Union, and all these other levels of coalition and other organizations that are union station that helped as well. If it wasn't for the coalition building of community and organizations, then it would not have passed. And here's the biggest part for me when it comes to coalition building is that there was only one person on the entire Pasadena City Council that actually supported Measure H. No one else did, including our including our mayor. And so when it comes to coalition building, it's so powerful because coalition building really has to do with the people, right? The organizations that are around. And so what we did was we just got a whole bunch of coalitions together, individuals together, and we started knocking on doors. It was a grassroots campaign. There was even a No on Measure H campaign that came out and raised millions of dollars to try to stop the Measure H campaign. But we still came through at the end of the day. And I think it was because of the cohesiveness of our group that we continue to build on. So I would say this is that it wasn't just a 2-year span of how we got rent control. It was over 20 years. 20 years ago, people were fighting for rent control in Pasadena. And 20 years later, we have it. And so, if I would say anything to anybody that's been trying to build coalition or that's been trying to get policy to pass, my biggest advice to you is to keep going. You might not see it now, but sooner or later you will see that progress. The more you tell the story, the more the more that the people see the need, the more that the people see that there's a need to fight for it. And so that is definitely the biggest thing. Yes, thank you for saying that. Jess Rivas was actually our only city council person that actually supported Measure H. And so now families have a fighting chance to be able to afford rent, but not only afford rent, but one day afford to be able to buy a house, right? Because when you're not paying 50 to 80% of your income on rent, then you can save up money to buy a house one day. So yeah, that's really what we were definitely fighting for, and now it's our reality. But it's not just rent control. That was it, because there's a whole bunch of things that we can talk about in Pasadena that has played a part of it. And I'll go more deeper into that later on, but that's how we got it so far to pass.
Thank you. And just Reverend Zach, you want to just kind of share some of the legislation you're working on the statewide level?
I would love to. And I also think Brandon, you're making me think of something I heard the political director of a very significant labor union say last year as we were reflecting with some of our grassroots leaders about the victories of last fall. Electeds who are behind the electorate, which is a lot of them, who are not showing that they're willing to do bold things to advance the solutions that so many of us agree we need, they're just gonna become irrelevant. And I think the positive way to say it is there's an amazing opportunity for elected officials to maybe step further into their values than they have in the past because they were worried about other interests that were fighting against them on the other side. So I just think there's a great opportunity for all of us to be having conversations with our electeds about this. And segue, which leads me to share about SB 567, which Maria Elena Durazo is carrying, the Homelessness Prevention Act, which we're part of a state network called Pico, California. It's one of our top 3 bills this year that we're doing the community co-sponsor thing. And it would basically take the current statewide rent cap, which is up to 10%. Think about that. 10% if you're already paying $2,000. I mean, that's a lot of money. And take it down by half, and would do other things as well to help with enforcement. Because I mean, how many of us here, raise your hand if you know somebody who was in an area with rent protections, but the enforcement didn't happen, and so they still got evicted? We know that happens. We know that we need money for that. So SB 567 is one of the key things that I think goes up against some of the interests that Rabeya was outlining earlier. And there are a lot of great bills this year that each of us can just say, oh, okay, whether I'm part of an organization or not, here's how I want to try to weigh in this debate. And I think every organization, even if you don't traditionally do this, should pick a couple and say, well, let's at the very least, let's send letters and do a meeting or two. And that helps to build our capacity together as a movement to get farther and farther each cycle. Yeah. Can't hear you, Tara. There you go.
There we go. I had a maintenance person come to my house at the time I'm recording. I'm like, go figure, right? So if you hear any drilling in the background, please forgive me. But we're all about pivoting, right? And so Rabeya, can you maybe want to talk a little bit about what else we need to achieve, or any other policy advocacy that you think is needed to focus on to help us move and shift and move a little bit closer to what we're all trying to achieve around housing justice?
I think one of the key pieces to focus on is to really shift the narrative when it comes to housing, to really shift it to one that's centered on public health. Because I think if people start seeing housing as linked to health and to public health, then they will start looking at different solutions rather than constantly looking to market-based paradigms to try and figure this out. And I think the other piece around that also is, and I think Zach, you kept referring to this, which is the power of coalitions and of community organizing. Brandon, I think you mentioned that too. I think what people forget is that when you center the communities most impacted, that is what is actually going to shift the ground beneath us. It's actually what makes change. And I think that's what policymakers and a lot of corporate interests are actually afraid of. They're afraid of that people power because we've seen it at work. I don't know if many of you are aware, but we were part of a 10-year campaign, it's still ongoing, Stand LA, to basically phase out neighborhood oil drilling in the city of Los Angeles. And over 10 plus years, along with community, we shifted the narrative from one of protecting big oil and their profits to one of uplifting public health. And finally, last year, City Council passed the motion to phase out oil drilling in the city of LA. And to put into place a just transition task force that really was about how we move towards green energy and also retraining oil workers into these green jobs. So I mean, it's all of that put together. We worked on a citywide campaign with a large coalition with our ACT LA friends, and Zach, I think you guys were part of that too, right? United to House LA, which again was about figuring out how we create revenue to fund alternative models of housing and of ownership and community stewardship. And that passed as well. And that's now, well, being challenged in the courts by the realtors and corporate landlords, but hopefully we will prevail. But that is what people power is able to do. And I think, Tara, to your point, if that's what we can continue to work on and continue that community organizing and uplifting those voices, that's where the real power is. And that's when change happens.
Absolutely. I love that. Just, this uplifting the voices and continue to mobilize and community organizing and coalition building. And I know, Betti, you have done a lot of this work as well. Is there anything you would like to add to this discussion?
Yes, thank you. I think one thing that's really standing out in a lot of what I'm hearing is also just collaboration. I think when we think of the response for survivors, we tend to think about survivor advocates specifically, but there are so many providers that are encountering unhoused individuals who are survivors, but may not be upfront and identifying of that. And I think another part of the collaboration aspect and even the Domestic Violence Homeless Services Coalition is really bringing those two sectors together, homeless service providers and survivor service providers. And I think what's really important to also consider is ensuring that we are trying to create as much knowledge on trauma-informed care, on understanding how to respond to someone who's experienced trauma in the best ways, because we know that if that first experience of seeking support or asking for help is a negative experience or is not met with compassion and dignity, it will steer that person away from ever wanting to access support again. So I think it's also important when in my time when I was at the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority as a domestic violence coordinator. I also supported with helping develop the emergency transfer plan. And this is in accordance with VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act. All COCs are required to have an emergency transfer plan for an individual who is in a subsidized housing and is unsafe and needs to leave and get out of that unsafe situation. And there wasn't really a streamlined process for that. There was no way for a survivor in the community to access information around emergency transfers. And this was a great way that we were able to launch a website specifically for property managers and survivors and service providers, creating material that was customized to inform survivors of their right, but also launching a series of trainings in conjunction with the National Alliance for Safe Housing, where we were also able to educate providers on understanding that this is a human right for survivors to get out of an unsafe situation. And sadly, we were seeing that many survivors were staying in unsafe situations due to the fear that I'm going to lose my subsidy, I'm going to lose my housing. So even just the fact that sometimes we are moving a little slower on the curve of even these expectations that federally we're required to have, and being a part of that process, being able to receive calls from survivors, giving them the news that they were matched to a safer unit. It really is also about timing. I think that's something that I see as a high barrier for survivors. Is a lot of our systems, we don't collaborate always with other housing authorities. So the turnover to access housing to support a survivor can take weeks, months. And in that time, when someone is going through violence, so much can happen that we really need to have more seamless collaboration and communication. And these systems should be integrated with each other so we can better support getting someone out of an unsafe situation and unsafe area and into another safer community. And that was just some work that I did there that I think was really impactful. And it's really great to see that as I've left LASA, the emergency transfer plan has really grown. Trainings have continued to happen. And providers, when we would do those trainings, we had anywhere between 70 to 150 providers per session. And it's just an opportunity for folks to really understand the full scope of survivor rights, especially when we talk about accessing safe housing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Betti. And I know, Reverend Zach, you have to leave us here shortly before we start moving to our Q&A. And I just wanted to give you an opportunity before we move into the Q&A, just for any last closing thoughts that you may have before you head out.
Thank you. Yeah. And again, I'm really grateful, and I apologize for leaving early, but Mayor Bass says, please come to a meeting. You kind of got to go. So there's a bunch of coalition members in the next room here. We're going to be talking about some of these very things. I think the thing that's coming to mind for me, and it relates to this meeting that's about to happen, and I was thinking about it, Betti, as you were speaking. I was talking with Efrain Escobedo the other day, who used to be at CCF and is now running the nonprofit. Oh my gosh, I can't remember the name of the organization. He's going to kill me anyway. And one of his metaphors for LA County, which I think Rabeya said a version of earlier, is that if we think of it as a computer software and hardware, it was programmed for certain people's thriving and other people's constraint. And it takes time to reprogram it. And I think part of what many groups have tried to figure out in terms of reprogramming it for racial equity is what is actual collaboration between our government and our organizations look like? How can it be successful? What are ways that our government can move money through to organizations that really are on the ground in more efficient ways? So I think this is like a big challenge we're going to have to figure out together. So the LA County's got $38 billion, and they're controlling, most of the money that is really working with, it's like human services and health services and all of our folks who are the most impacted. How would we want to reprogram that system so that it helps all the people that, Betti has just talked about, and all the people who are coming through the YWCA? So I feel like that's like a real collective challenge, is how we shift our government's approach to us, to all of us as organizations, and build on the strengths that we have, instead of saying, oh yeah, well, it's just not really going to fit because your budget's not big enough. And I think some of our supervisors have tried to do some work to make it easier for smaller organizations to access dollars to do the awesome work they're already doing with people that they're not reaching through the programs that they're running. And what might that coordination and collaboration look like? So Yeah, just grateful for all the brilliant minds here, both on the panel and off the panel, and hopeful that we're gonna continue to get to a better place if we all stick to it.
All right. Thank you so much, Reverend Zach, for joining us. It was truly been great to have you be a part of this panel and planning this panel with you. And good luck in your meeting this afternoon at the mayor's office. And we'll be sending you positive vibes for some. So thank you so much. And now I'm gonna, before I shift to the question Q&A piece of it, I wanted just to see if there's anything else you all would like to add in regards to what was been discussed today so far. Any comments? We'll definitely wrap this up for last comments. But before we shift to the Q&A, just wanted to see if there was any other kind of thoughts that you were holding on to that you wanted to share, and I want to hold space for that. We're ready for the Q&A. All right. So again, just thank you guys so much. Thanks everyone so much. I just hearing so much about all of the different ways we can take action, the way that you have already taken action, what people can do in the community, private and public sectors, the importance of collaboration, the importance of coalition building and community organizing, to really create a place where housing is really looked at as a health and human rights issue. So thank you all for that conversation. In addition to having to, educate ourselves, right? So we have to continue to educate ourselves, continue to understand all of the nuances and the systemic barriers that impact unhoused, unsheltered people, and how we can both also participate in civic engagement. And so thank you all so much again for just helping us talk about the crisis of homelessness and housing. So now we're going to go over to see if we about questions. I want to thank Saybrook University, Dr. Crystal Ishihara, for moderating that chat, and we'll be elevating some questions for us. So Crystal.
Thanks, Tara. We have a participant, Gina, who actually has her hand up. Gina, did you want to ask your question yourself? If not, I have some of your questions in my notes as well. She might not be able to unmute. So I will, there were quite a few questions. The first one was from Stephen. Stephen asked, can the fight for housing, specifically rentals, lead to equity and ownership? Then I'll get to Gina's question.
Can the fight for housing lead to equity and ownership? Was a question?
Correct. Yes.
Anybody have any thoughts on that? I mean, I'm thinking of, if we all talk about, generational wealth, and having ownership is part of that generational wealth. Any thoughts on what can we do around the issue of equity and home ownership? I know we talked a lot about rental and homelessness, but home ownership is also a part of that continuum.
So for me, that's one of the reasons why I supported rent control, because I believe that there's steps to it, right? All of us do not come from generational wealth. There's a lot of us that are that have to work for what we will get, what we have. And so as I stated before, if you're paying 50 to 80% of your income on rent, there's a very small margin for you to save to be able to own, right? And so that's one of the reasons why we fought for rent control. Also, on my commission, one of the panelists talked about redlining. And so on my commission, it had just brought to the forefront that one of our past mayors and a law firm in Pasadena actually fought to actually stop African Americans from buying houses in certain areas. And now that law firm, which is majority women owned now, is trying to change that narrative. And for me, you can't erase the history. At the end of the day, it happened, and however we come back from it is fine, but we cannot erase history, because if we erase history, then we're liable to let it happen again. And so we've been having conversations about down payment assistance, right? Instead of, just always talking about, well, we need to educate our community on finances. Yeah, that's great. And we've been doing that for years. But I think now we have to start putting our money where our mouth is and actually start putting money towards down payment assistance, right? Starting to help people fix their credit. How do you keep your credit good? How do you should you apply for student loans? And it goes all the way back to the school day ages, really how we change our mindset behind that. And so for me, one thing that I've done in my community is for the last 3 years, I started a segment called Millennial Shift, which is to get my generations to change our mindset about finance, home buying, real estate, and all the above. And so we just did our third one in January. And 2 weeks ago, we got notice that 4 of the individuals that went to that class actually are now home buyers, and it only took them 3 months to do that. And so that's something for me, right? And those are just a little steps of things that I can do or things that I've done that are small to help my community to be able to buy homes, is really to connect them to the right people. Because another thing that I found out is that there's a lot of people who are qualified to buy a home and who are able to do so, but just don't know how to do it, right? Don't know how to start, where to start. And so it's really, connecting our community to the right pieces and putting those pieces together. So to answer your question, yes, I believe that if we have affordable housing, it can definitely lead to house buying or home buying, but also home buying is the biggest generational wealth builder that we have as society. When we pass down our homes, like one of the things that it gets me every single time that in Pasadena we had so many African-American homeowners, and as of right now we're at 5% African-American in Pasadena. And that's mostly because a lot of them have sold their homes and moved on. Or, after they have passed away, they left their homes to the next generation and they didn't know what to do with it. So they lost it. And so, education is a big piece of it. But I think it's possible at the end of the day.
Yeah, if I could just step in, I think certainly the conversation around housing and right to housing can lead to these other pieces. And, Brandon, there's what you said. There are other models as well of home ownership, which would be community ownership as well as community stewardship. And there's a slight difference between the two. I think community stewardship is more about, we did the land acknowledgement at the beginning here. So, right. So that piece is more about how are we as responsible community members connected to the land, and how do we steward that land? So it is a type of ownership, but it's also about stewarding the land and healing that relationship. But, these models exist and they have been put into practice. And I saw someone in the chat, I think, talked about the TOPA strategies, which is certainly one of them. But just to give an example, I'll give 2 examples. One is in the county of LA in the last 2 years, a small coalition of folks which came out of the Healthy LA coalition that Zach had referenced. It actually put together a policy on community ownership that asked the county board of supervisors to invest monies to help residents purchase and rehabilitate multifamily housing as it came on the market, and rather before it actually went completely onto the market. And we did a small pilot project, and the County Board of Supervisors were so impressed with it that they actually have now invested $14 million on rehab and acquisition to help community residents buy their properties, the multifamily housing that they live in order to turn it into some sort of TOPA property. And so that definitely exists and that's working. The other example I want to give, and this will be just a push for one of our coalitions, ACT LA, Alliance for Community Transit, we are actually going to be launching next week our social housing campaign, which is actually looking at different models of community ownership and stewardship. And we've actually put together a whole campaign, having worked a year and a half to almost 2 years with community members on defining what those models are going to look like and what policies are going to look like to lead us there. And so I'm happy to share that with Tara and Fabiola, if you guys want to send that information out for the webinar that we'll be having next week. But, you know, again, to answer your question, it is possible for that. And I think it also behooves us to look beyond the current financial systems. The financials, these current systems, as I had mentioned, have been created to benefit a specific group of people based on their skin color. And while we are living in that system and we may still need to work with it, I think, as I said, it behooves us to look beyond it and start thinking about new ways of financing and these other ways of community ownership and stewardship that actually are inclusive of everyone.
Thank you so much. We had some really great comments in the while you guys are having this discussion. So thanks, Karen. Koch talked about public banking as a way to reimagine the financial system. She talked, so as a one strategy, she also shared with us converting rentals into limited equity co-ops as another possible solution. So thank you for that, Karen. And back to you, Crystal. Any more questions?
Yeah, quite a bit. So another one, going back to Brandon's comment on education, Gina had asked, how do we center the issues and inequities around education, which subsequently leads to unemployment, underemployment, and then becoming unsheltered?
How do we center equity around the other institutional structures, right? That could lead, that ultimately, if we don't, will lead to becoming unhoused or homeless, right? Is that the question?
I think it's basically saying that education is, or the lack of education can be a pipeline to homelessness.
Mm-hmm.
But Gina, feel free to correct me from misspeaking.
Anybody have any thoughts or comments on that? Oh, yeah.
Hi everyone, this is Gina. So I'm an LAUSD teacher and I see the marginalized spaces that are unfortunately unsheltered. I teach in Pacoima. And I see that not having access equitably, like not having highly qualified teachers or the proper technology and all of those things. We just striked about 3 weeks ago, not for us, but for our siblings that are in classified positions like, you know, cafeteria workers, paraprofessionals. And now we're trying to get some freedom for our own selves as teachers. Like, I guess it's more of a rhetorical question, because at the end of the day, if our children do not have good education, then that leads to not having employment or underemployment. And then that does lead to not being sheltered properly. So, I mean, do we take these on separately, or how do we do this in a way that we're not overwhelming ourselves, I guess, is the question.
Gina, if I could respond, I mean, I'm not an expert in education policy, but I was just thinking as you were speaking, I mean, certainly we need to be able to address those inequities in education. And what comes to mind for me is just the public financing for public education and just how flawed that is. But again, I don't know much about that, but I'm just wondering, you know, in many of our coalitions, we're talking about, you know, cross-coalition solidarity, and really figuring out how, as we work on the particular issues that our coalition is focused on, we can connect to other groups and find out places of connection, as well as how we can uplift their campaign and their advocacy and support them, so that we're all, you know, we're not all doing all of it all at once, right?
Right.
But at the same time, we are showing up with some type of united voice saying, this is what we need. And by the way, you don't get to pit us against our allies in this coalition because that's needed too. And I think it goes back to building that reality of abundance and rejecting the smoke and mirrors tactic that a lot of policymakers and systems create to just keep making us fight with each other over these false choices so that they can continue doing whatever else they're doing in the other place. So
Right.
yeah.
I agree with you. And I think that's kind of like Cecily Mayat Cruz, who is UTLA, United Teachers Los Angeles, our union's president. That's one of the things. She's not just taking on what's happening or not happening for teachers and classified workers. She's taken on Black Lives Matter and all other organizational structures that work for people that are on the fringes, that are voiceless. And so, right now we have a superintendent that by the end of the school year is projected to have $5.2 billion in reserve. That's not going into helping our students. And so, I have there's schools within LAUSD where it's largely kids are living in hotels. So there is an intersectionality.
Absolutely. Thank you, Gina. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for that
If I
engagement.
can,
Thank you.
Brandon?
sorry, just 2 seconds. And I think we have to reimagine education as well, right? And so let me be very clear. I am a person that believes in education, all types of education. I don't want nobody to leave here and saying, Brandon, don't believe in it. I do. But I think that we always stick success to 4-year degrees or master degrees or doctorate degrees, right? And so I think one thing that we have, our education system has left behind are trades, right? And I think we have to get back into the trades, because what I'm even learning now is that most trades actually leads to union jobs, meaning stable income or livable wages, right? And so, if you don't know what project labor agreements are, I think you guys should look up project labor agreements. That's something that a small group of us are fighting for, some entities in Pasadena, to be able to get, so that our apprenticeship programs, when young people leave our apprenticeship programs, they can actually go into these labor unions, and instead of making $20 an hour for a construction job, they're actually starting off making $50 an hour, So I think there's more into the education system that we should look into. But I think as far as the education system goes, we have to also go back to teaching our young people trades, how to make money, what is entrepreneurship, right? But then also we have to start teaching them how to invest and save, because you cannot just live in a society. We all can agree that we can't just live in a society where you are just living based upon the one income that you have. Nowadays, you have to have multiple incomes to survive in society, right? But we have to teach that at a young age. We have to teach investing at a young age. We have to teach community building and community investing at a young age. And so I think those also helps reimagine our systems as well.
Brandon? Chris? Sorry. Oh, yes.
Sorry,
Yes, please.
Is it okay? And I know I might kind of go a little bit on a tangent, but one thing that I also think of when I think of even just the intersection of domestic violence and homelessness is that how we begin to have those conversations with our youth, and having these conversations on understanding what is a healthy relationship, what is your boundary, building that self-awareness. And I just wanted to highlight, I used to work at an organization in Metro LA, Peace Over Violence, and they had stop clubs, students together organizing peace. And it was just a really great way to build that collaboration between local nonprofits that are activating youth in these critical conversations that really tend to become a trajectory of advocates in the future, but really collaborating with schools so that students can start to have this conversation, organize with their peers, and begin to really even transform how they see relationships. We know that 1 in 3 youth are encountering unhealthy relationships, which only increases their statistic of experiencing domestic violence in their adult years. So I think just another element to even avoid the trajectory of facing housing instability or homelessness is to begin to also have these conversations around healthy relationships, considering that domestic violence is a precursor to homelessness. I just wanted to drop kind of that collaborative piece as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Betti, for bringing that perspective. It's really important. It's part of the work that we do as well. And that's why you're on the panel, because we really feel like we need to continue to center issues related to violence against women as we talk about all of these other issues as well. So thank you so much. Another question, Crystal?
So this one is from Lisa. I'll just share her comments as well. She says, thank you so much for all of your hard work, leadership in medicine, making impact with creating change. About 25% of all homeless adults in Los Angeles County suffer from severe mental illnesses, such as psychotic disorders and schizophrenia. Many are 18 to 25. What do you all believe regarding the effectiveness of the care court implementation?
Familiar with that? I'm not familiar either.
If not, I also have some additional questions we can address, and maybe we can reach out.
That. And if somebody has, if somebody out in the audience has anything to share about that, did somebody say yes?
Yeah, it's me who asked.
Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for everything, all of your comments and all of everything that you're sharing, being here. The care court is initiated in January, and they're implementing it first in LA County. And the care court that for the most mentally ill members of the unhoused population, bringing them in and actually bringing them in and detaining them and forcing them into evaluation and into some sort of temporary housing and into medical evaluation and care. And there's been a lot of controversy about civil rights, obviously, and also about disproportionality. And there's also a lot of support from the Board of Supervisors, including Supervisor Barger, in terms of believing that we need to treat those most mentally ill amongst us and give them the opportunity to be housed. So I was just curious if anyone had heard about that implementation called the Care Court.
No, but thank you, Lisa, for bringing that to our attention. And maybe that's something we can maybe follow up and have a conversation about with our panelists and other coalitions that we're a part of, but thank you. Crystal? And do we need to do a time check? Yes, we have 8 minutes.
Yeah, we have about 8 minutes left. I have a couple of other questions. I'll just go to one of the general ones, maybe to end on a good note. So just to everybody, how have the lives of unhoused, unsheltered people changed because of your work?
That's a beautiful question. Anyone have a story to share, or a success story, or throughout your years of doing this work, and whatever hat or role you played in?
I guess I'll keep going first. I think when it comes to that, because of my work and because of not only just my work, but my heart for my community. A lot of you might not know, but I ran for city council last year, and for me, it was a big thing for me because I wanted to really see where my constituents were, how they lived, the conditions that they lived in. And so I knocked on every door in my district 2.5 times, which was a lot. But for me, I was able to see how each and every last one of them lived in their conditions, all the way from our unhoused neighbors. I was going into our parks and literally sitting down, having conversations with them, and meeting people with master degrees that had their paperwork on them and they were still homeless and living in parks. And so I am able to advocate for them and organize with them on a whole nother level, but also able to help them to advocate for themselves. I think it's one thing for us to help people to advocate or advocate for them. But it's a whole nother level when we are able to educate our communities on how to help them to advocate for themselves and speak up for themselves and tell their own stories. And so for the work that I've done in the city and professionally, we teach people to advocate for themselves and how to effectively advocate and show up every single time. And one thing I'll say is that, you know, if we're going to continue to make change, I guess I'll put the elephant in the room. If we're going to continue to make change, we have to reimagine, here's that word again, our local government, right? We have to start putting people in place and start voting in people that actually listen to the voices of the community. Because the truth of the matter is that, you know, we were saying for a long time that we wanted rent control. But until, and our city council, all of them said no, except one, for a very long time. But until the people actually came together and said, this is what we wanted, we're going to get signatures and everything like that to do it. And it finally got passed, then it happened. But what if we had people that actually supported the initiative and we didn't have to go 2 years in without fighting for all this kind of stuff, when we actually voting in people that's sitting on that seat that's saying, hey, yeah, we do need it, right? Just like climate change and just like police reform and so many other things, right? And so I think we have to start reimagining the people that we put in place to make these decisions, because it's not only just affordable housing, but also when it comes to affordable housing, it's also about zoning, right? Having the right zoning. How do we look at zoning and how areas are being zoned for affordable housing? And so there's so much to put in there, but I think we just have to reimagine how we look at policy.
Thank you, Brandon. Betti, Rabeya, I would love to give you guys a minute here or 30 seconds to share anything that you think that the group might want to hear.
Yeah, I would like to share. I think more aligned with my role now as Director of Training and Partnerships is training the community and helping build the knowledge in the community on how to better support, respond, and show up for survivors. And not to take away that individuals don't have that human nature of compassion, but many times when we don't really understand the intersections of the struggle of any form of gender-based violence, it really takes away our ability to hold space for that person, to understand the complexities that that person faces in terms of barriers, access to service. So I pride myself on trying to train. I've been honored to train community members who want to become volunteers, initiatives on DV 101, 102, creating curriculum. But my greatest joy is when I speak with the providers who participate and they don't share how they did it in their work when you feel like that is what's required of you, but how those skills were transferable in their personal relationships and how they were able to become a better support person to those that are near to them. And it's only transformed their perception on how they serve the community. And as I continue in this role, that's my goal, is to bring community trainings. That's my plug. If you're interested, DWC does have those. And I think it's just important that we support each other with expanding our knowledge and improving our response to survivors who are facing housing instability or homelessness.
Thank you, Betti. Please drop that information in the chat for us. Rabeya.
Yeah, I was looking for some numbers, and there are quite a few, but I'll just, since I talked about the county policy, the TOPA policy on acquisition and rehab for tenants to purchase their buildings. In the first year and a half, I think 75 units throughout LA County were identified for that, and have been going through the process to convert those units into TOPA properties. So
Awesome.
I'm not sure how many of those 75 went through, because, you know, there's all the due diligence and all, but I mean, that's quite a bit. So, yeah.
I love that, you know, talking about just changing the narrative, right? And finding to do things in different ways, and not within this current system. It's the current system is really built not to support those people that we're trying to help, and trying to create solutions for the current system is not always the best thing. And so thank you for sharing that. On behalf of the panelists and the staff and partners and collaborators, I want to thank you all for being here today. We're closing this panel with increased understanding of the barriers that unsheltered, unhoused people face when seeking services and solutions, mainly barriers regarding societal barriers, organizational barriers, and systemic racism and punitive laws. Solutions, we've heard about community organizing, bridging, belonging, advocating for solutions, educating individuals, young people, engaging communities, engaging people with lived experience in the design and decision-making and implementation, and on policy advocacy, and also making sure that we're doing all of this work in a culturally and linguistically appropriate ways. So thank you all so much for being with us today. We were here today to engage, to build a sense of community and belonging and a continued fight for housing and justice, because being unhoused can happen to anyone, and we know that. So thanks again so much for everyone. More resources, there's lots of resources in the chat, lots of links in the chat. Make sure you save the chat. We will definitely be following up with all the participants in an email. We will make this video available on our YouTube channel. So we will definitely have that available. And again, just so much gratitude to Fabiola, the YWCA Glendale Pasadena, and all the YWCA Glendale Pasadena staff who are on this call that work every day to support victims of domestic violence through our Domestic Violence Housing First program and our emergency program. I want to give them a shout out as well. And again, thank you all so much, and enjoy your evening and be safe. Bye, everybody.